Hello, everyone. Just to let everyone know that this will be recorded and will be uploaded to the National Museum of the Great Lakes online platforms. So if you want to relive this moment every day for the rest of your life, you're obviously welcome to. But after the fact, you will be able to view this and listen to the insight. And in case somebody who you know should have been here, maybe you could share it after the fact. If you know, you could always invite them right now. But just so you know, that is why all of you will be muted and have your cameras off for your own privacy. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. My name is Chris Shell. I am the experience manager here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes, and I will be the host. I will also be, relaying some of the messages or questions that you have to our wonderful author throughout the talk today. But before we can do that, I wanted to just mention a few things. Welcome again, everyone, to the very first installment of the 2025 Great Lakes Book Club. Today is, I think, actually our first event of the year here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. And if you are not familiar with what we do, our mission is to preserve, share, and celebrate the past, present, and future of the Great Lakes story. And one major way that we are doing that currently is that we are in the midst of a 5,000 square foot expansion, really a once in a lifetime sort of expansion around here that will build dedicated areas for temporary and traveling exhibits. It will allow us to better tell the story of the Great Lakes and also include, and I'm biased as the experience manager, a brand new Great Lakes Community Education Center, which is really exciting. If you have not heard about our second wave expansion, there's a lot of really interesting materials online at nmgl.org/the second wave. Follow the blog, follow along. The grand opening will be right around the corner, June 28th. It feels right around the corner to me, but June 28th. And I'm going to put links in the chat as I mention these things. The next thing I'd like to do is to introduce our moderator for today, lead museum educator Faith Curry, who will be moderating, of course. I will be supporting Faith in everything that I can do. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce our wonderful author, the guest of honor. The author today has published 16 books. Her newest, Trouble Island, is a historical suspense inspired by bootlegging and family history. Our author is a contributing editor to Writer's Digest, for which she writes the column Leveling Up Your Writing Life and teaches for Writer's Digest University. She is also a three-time recipient of the Individual Excellent Award in Literary Arts from Ohio Arts Council and has been a John E. Nance Writer-in-Residence at Thurber House. Our author currently serves as president of the Midwest chapter of Mystery Writers of America. And as Jess Montgomery, our author writes the historical kinship mysteries set in the 1920s and inspired by Ohio's true first female sheriff. When not writing, our author enjoys spending time with family and friends, reading, swimming, and occasionally hiking. Everyone, I'd like to welcome Sharon Short.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, hi everybody. We're just really happy to have Sharon here today. We're excited. Sharon, I know that you have, a whole series of other books that took place in the same time period. Can you tell us a little bit about the particular inspiration that led you to cover that same time period, but diverge into the subject of Trouble Island? Like, what led you to want to do that?
Okay, thank you. Good question. So there are actually two lines of inspiration, if you will. One was family history. My husband's great aunt was married to a very nasty man who abused her and was a criminal. He robbed stores, and so he was not a good guy, not a good guy at all. And they couldn't have kids, and she adopted a pet monkey who she named Betty after Betty Grable. This was in the 50s. And one day he hurt the monkey, he hurt Betty, and that was too much for Great Aunt Ruth. So she picked up his gun and shot him dead. And she was taken to jail, of course. And Betty, the monkey, was taken to the Humane Society. They both went on a hunger strike, uh, pining for one another. And my far in the future at the time, father-in-law, who was also just a new attorney, was given the phone call. You need to go take care of Aunt Ruth. So he did. She was let go basically on a technicality, and because the judge was well aware of how abusive Pony, her husband, had been. And I learned this whole story like the week before I got married. And I was just fascinated by this woman and thought I need to write a short story or an essay, something. And that was 41 years ago, because we've been married 41 years. Um, and so that idea just kind of floated around in my head. And then fast forward to our older daughter being in fifth grade and going on a field trip to Stone Lab, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I happened to be one of the chaperones. And so we're standing near the lab and, on South Bass Island. And um, one of the other chaperones points and says, "See that spit of land out in the lake? Yeah, yeah. Well, that's actually Middle Island in Canadian waters. And it was owned at one time by a gangster, and there was a mansion and shenanigans. And then some fifth grader, I don't know, threw up or pulled somebody's ponytail or whatever. And we were totally distracted. And that's all I got about Middle Island at the time. And I was really fascinated about that. But I couldn't figure out, once again, what is this setting for? How should I write an article? And I didn't come up with anything that worked. And then about 3 years ago, the idea of Great Aunt Ruth and the idea of Middle Island collided in my mind. It's kind of like peanut butter and chocolate. It was the
Mm-hmm.
Reese's cup idea. And so I was taken by the notion of moving Ruth's story back in time to the 30s to fit the history of the island, um, and go from there. So that's how I ended up writing about this small island in Lake Erie. And it's a fascinating island. It's got so much history for such a teeny little dot of land.
That's fascinating to know. Like I knew that there was family inspiration, but not that specific one. And the way that you used the animal and the villain, right? To move it back to that time when Lake Erie was full of criminal activity during Prohibition.
Yes.
That's really cool to know.
Thank you.
Now, have you gotten a lot of good response from people in Ohio and from the Great Lakes region in particular to the book?
I have. I have been up to do two events actually at Gathering Volumes, a wonderful bookstore that covers all genres that's in Perrysburg, Ohio. So those of you who are living up there, and if you haven't been to Gathering Volumes, I highly recommend it. And my reception there was quite warm. And then I've heard from people who Ohioans seem to like the story. People in general seem to like the story. And when I was researching the story, I went back to um, Put-in-Bay and hiked that island. Actually, my younger daughter, but not the one who was in the fifth grade when I learned about Middle Island, and I went, and I wanted to go as far late into the winter as I could on a public ferry, and
Mm-hmm.
that happened to be like like the week before Thanksgiving, a couple of years ago. And so we went. We were the only tourists on the island, literally. And so we chatted with people that we ran into at the gas station, and we went to the library, we went to the grocery, like we talked to people who live there year round. Did a lot of research in their community library, and the librarian was fantastic. And everybody who came in, she'd say, "This lady is writing a book that includes gangsters set on Lake Erie."
Oh,
And
wow.
to a person, the patron would say, "Well, my great grandfather was a rum runner. Well, my great uncle," everybody had a story, and nobody was like, "Oh, no, no, I think it's because the history is so far in the past that it's kind of easy to
Right.
romanticize
And
prohibition."
Americans have that gangster fascination anyway with
Yeah,
movies and books, right?
yeah, we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so even in the research process, people have been enthusiastic and supportive, which I really appreciate.
I saw similar comments to what you're relaying when I was looking at reviews. Because before we have a book club, I like to look at all the like readers' online reviews because sometimes I can gain like insight on what a good question or something people might want to know is. And I saw tons of reviews where someone wanted to include, I have a grandma from Ohio, or I visited it, right? They were all in there. People want to share. Yeah.
They do.
Um, so related to the research, I know that you did a lot of research here at our museum. Can you tell us what things in our museum inspired you? I'm guessing the Fresnel lenses might have been part of that, right? Can you explain
Absolutely.
the interior museum
Yes.
inspiration?
Yeah, the museum was pivotal, actually. I've completed the first draft. I'd gotten the manuscript to the point where it was solid, but still needed some depth to characters, still needed some depth to the history. And our younger daughter happens to live in Toledo, and we were up visiting, and she said, "Well, haven't you been to the Great Lakes Museum?" No, I haven't. Well, let's go. So the three of us went, and what an amazing museum you have. It's so
Thank
beautiful.
you.
It's so well designed. But yeah, the displays about lighthouses, the displays about winter on the lake, the shipping history, and then being on the ship there, and spending several hours just going into every accessible spot, where they slept, the engine room, everything. It was just so eye-opening. And for two of the characters, Eddie and Henry, they didn't have really well flashed out um, stories about themselves once I'd finished this draft. But then after I went to the museum, actually, while I was at the museum, my imagination just sort of started going wild. And I figured out the backstory for these two characters and how they would have met on the Great Lakes, on a ship and so forth, and what that would have been like. And then, of course, the huge storm that killed, I forget how many people back in the early 1900s. I learned about it at your museum. So it was very inspirational. I recommend it to everybody that I talk to at book clubs, and I can't wait to visit again.
Oh, that's great. Let us know before you come so we can make that visit as special as possible. I particularly wondered about Aurelia's like diving and swimming suit. Did you base any of that on the old fashioned like diving swimming suits you saw at the museum?
We did, yeah.
Okay.
So I knew I wanted her to be able to swim in November in Lake Erie, which
Mm-hmm.
does not mean just going out in your swimsuit and jumping in, as everyone knows. Actually, when I did the research trip to the island, I didn't swim in the lake, but I waded in just to prove to myself that it's really, really cold. So I knew I wanted her to be able to swim for at least a period of time in the water, and that she needed some kind of protective covering or she would die. So I did some research, realized that would not have been super handy um, to her on the island at that time. So, there weren't like wetsuits that you could go and buy at Dick's Sporting Goods or whatever. So I realized, though, that there would have been materials at the lighthouse um, and around the lake that she could have used to create her own wetsuit. So I had her do that. I realized, I've created a really smart character who
Mm-hmm.
loves to read all the time, and she is very observant and she tracks birds. She can invent a wetsuit about 10 years before they were actually invented.
Right. Okay. So speaking of her like being smart and having being a multi-skilled, resourceful person, when not all mysteries or suspense novels start out this way, but because she was observing all the other characters and sharing her opinion about them, I felt like it took a little bit of time to decide, is this a reliable narrator or not? Did you intend that or
Mhm.
to happen that way?
I did, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, she turned, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't finished the book, she is a reliable narrator. But I wanted that to kind of be in doubt at first
Mm-hmm.
because she has a um, problematic history, right? So, of course, she's going to be defensive of the choices she made and what she did. But how do we trust somebody who, I mean, you can understand why in the heat of the moment, Great Aunt Ruth, as well as my character, took the actions they took. But still,
Right.
that's murder. So how are we going to trust this person? And I wanted that doubt to kind of linger about halfway through the book, and then readers just start to realize, oh no, we can trust her. Um, I think by then she's earned the reader's
Yeah,
trust.
I think that part was done well, but also it makes it like a more enjoyable journey because you are taking time to trust her, partly through her reliable observations of others that prove to be true as you go. This
Right.
one, I don't. I was going to try to save a question like this for the end, but I'm going to work it in a little bit now. If we meet, like at the end of this book, Aurelia like kind of hints that there's even more we don't know, right? Um, and she's got something, she's moving towards some sort of future. If we meet her again, will we be like put back in that position maybe of reestablishing her as reliable, or do you think we'll jump right in?
Oh, so I like to believe if we meet her, let's say 5 years later, after the
Mm-hmm.
end of Trouble Island, that we'll recognize her as the reliable young lady that we
Okay.
came to know and hopefully love, at least a little, throughout Trouble Island. And I also, like to envision her as at peace with herself and in healthy, happy relationships because she hasn't had those her
Mm-hmm.
whole life, even her childhood. So that's how I like to envision her at peace,
Okay.
somewhere warm, and in good relationships.
Okay, that's good to know. You talked a little bit about the monkey. I was curious about maybe where the idea for the parrot came from, and now we know that. And I thought it was like especially timely and interesting that, only Murders in the Building, which a lot of people have probably watched, had like a
Mhm.
parrot as a major plot point. And
That's true.
I know how the publishing calendar also works, that you had your idea before we all saw Only Murders in the Building. But I thought that was an interesting coincidence. Did you watch that and also think like, hey, I've got a
Yes.
parrot, yeah,
Yeah, I
as a
did. And
plot
I love
device,
that
yeah.
series. Yeah, sometimes it's interesting. Sometimes in the artistic world, whether it's music or movies or paintings or whatever, it's like 10 people independently come up with the same idea. And I don't
Hmm.
know what that's about, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah, it does make it more fun when it's in a couple, places that are clearly different. And like I said, I knew that it would have been thought of and written before because
Right.
publishing can take forever, right?
Yeah, it's about a
From
year
start to
from
finish.
from the final accepted, yes, this is, we're going to publish this. This is as solid as the writer can make it. Then there's a whole year of copy edits, proofreading, cover design, a marketing plan. So yeah, by the time you're holding a book in your hand, the author's been done with it between a year or two.
Hmm. Okay. And the characters that all have their own different backgrounds, you have the character who is former law enforcement. You also introduce that that's something that the gangsters of that time, like Eddie's gangsters and things, that's
Right.
something that's taking place in the rum running industry. Was that something you came upon in research, or like something that we just know is possible, that sometimes you've got a criminal who's really a secret law enforcement, and sometimes you've got former law enforcement, right, that gets it all mixed up. Did you come across that in your research, or was it more of a general like suspense and mystery like trope that you wanted to include?
Right. It was a little bit of
Or
both.
both?
So as Chris mentioned in in the introduction, I under the pen name Jess Montgomery have written 4 books inspired by Ohio's true first female sheriff, and that happened in 1926. The first female sheriff was 25. I'm sorry, was in our state, and so of course, if I'm writing 4 books set in the 20s, I did a lot of research already about bootlegging. I've done a deep dive into prohibition and bootlegging, and how is very complicated history. And it's hard to tell it's not easy to tell the players apart, because
Mm-hmm.
you're absolutely right. I didn't come up with the notion that there would be criminals who were really spies, or cops or former cops who were really criminals, because it's documented through pretty much any bootlegging or
Mm-hmm.
prohibition history that you would ever look up. But I wanted to have that juxtaposition. So it was a purposeful choice. It was a realistic choice, but it was also a purposeful choice.
Yeah. And there were some because we've got, an exhibit coming up that's about rum running after our expansion is completed. And so some of our other programming and content has been related to that. And so I've had to look up a lot the last few months, and, besides reading Trouble Island. And there were, federal law enforcement and local and everything who sometimes got involved for the money and sometimes against their will, sort of, because if you know a secret about someone, you know, back then that was valuable and you could get them to do what you could coerce them to do what you wanted. And so another thing that I wondered, since we get to know the characters in different lights, you kind of reveal and hold back and reveal so that we get to know all the characters as we go. Did any of the characters change and reveal themselves to you while you were writing? Like, did any characters that you had plans for change direction in your own story? Where you're like, oh, I didn't know they were going to do that. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Yes. So the initial drafts, Henry and Maxine were not nice
Oh,
to Aurelia. And then I thought, this is too much. It's too many mean people in this book. We need somebody to, be an ally, to be someone that Aurelia can turn to for comfort, and that we can, have a lot of sympathy for. So I shifted Henry and Maxine in that way. And then I also realized, after I'd written the first few drafts, that I did not have a very diverse cast at all. So I decided that I needed a bit of that. So if we think of Liam, he's on the spectrum, but we would not have said that in 1932. But through how he speaks and how he acts, for example, I try to show that, because people have always been neurodiverse. We just didn't necessarily have that terminology. People have always been, LGBTQ. We just didn't necessarily include folks from that community in our stories that, back in the day. So I wanted to have a representation of real people,
mm-hmm.
on this very small island. So they did change, and that's true for anything I write. The first, and it's true for many, many writers, that you think the characters, or you think the outcome, and then as you're working with your own imagination and the material, you realize, oh, we need to make a few changes here to have. So it's a mix of inspiration, but then also just logically setting down and objectively as possible, keeping in mind, you did make this up. Um, how do you revise and grow the characters so that they feel more well-rounded, and that their relationships are more well-rounded, and that there's diversity, not just in who the people are, but the roles that they play.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you only need I didn't want to have 2 romantic interests. I didn't want to have 5 sympathetic ears, so I very
Right.
much try to balance all that.
Yeah, I loved the detail with the little descriptive notes on the shelves, for
Yeah.
that. Like when I was reading that, I'm like, okay, we have a character with a special interest here, right?
Hmm.
And we,
Hmm.
like that was really well done and it was very natural,
Thank
feeling.
you.
It's interesting to know too about Harry and Maxine not being sympathetic in the beginning because I I thought they were interesting in that they were guarded, right? But they were not unkind, right? And then of course they go through a shift where they decide we're going to have to take a leap of faith in Aurelia, right? They get to that point. So that was a neat evolution through the story. Yeah. And let's see. Okay, another thing that I wondered about is that I know that authors don't always have a lot to do with exactly how the marketing goes, right? And the reviews and things like that. And so a lot of it, the things I saw when I was looking into like the different, I look at consumer reviews and magazine reviews and the publisher's materials to get ready. And there's a lot of like pitching it as a locked room mystery.
Mhm.
And that's a popular genre, but it's popular just in cultural activities too, the locked room things. Did you think of that starting out? Because the whole like island and you can't get off, there were a lot of places to explore. It wasn't like locked in the building. It put me more in mind of like an Agatha Christie style situation.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
were you also thinking of locked room, or is that more, did it happen to apply?
It's a little bit of both. It did happen to
Okay.
apply, but I also, set it in winter just to make everything really hard for me and for the characters that I created. So in that way, the island is metaphorically a room, or we could call it like a closed circle mystery. There's, you know, nobody's getting off the island, and nobody's getting on the island in the time frame that this novel covers. And there are, they're not in a room, but they're very, kind of forced closeness because of the weather and the small island and the storm. And so I had to be very mindful of where every character was for every minute
Uh-huh.
because, I didn't want to accidentally leave a character like lurking in the hallway at the end of chapter 2, and then there's a secret being whispered just right inside the parlor. And oh wait, but then the person lurking in the hallway would have heard this, so I had to sort all of that out. And you mentioned Agatha Christie, and yes, I do. The trope is a nod to Agatha Christie, great body of work, and also a bit to Rebecca. I love that novel. The idea of Manderley and looking back after
Mm-hmm.
all the events have unfolded. And then I named Largo after the movie Key Largo. So that was my nod to another island, warmer climb, but with a storm and criminals, So that was my little nod to that.
Okay. Now you mentioned Rebecca. Did you think of the mansion um, as a character when you were writing? And I could easily picture you thinking of the lighthouse and the stairs and that whole structure, that separate building as a character, because it did have like a personality and it had, depth. There were things there that people felt because they were in there. And the mansion, I wondered that too, but it's also more corporeal maybe, whereas you wrote the lighthouse situation a little more, surreal, like it could have its own spirit or something. Can you talk
Right,
about that?
right. Sure. So I'm fascinated by lighthouses. And Middle Island did have a lighthouse. It was decommissioned in the early 1900s. Um, and so I pulled on the history of the lighthouse on Middle Island in old photos to try to, bring that to life accurately. And then thought about all the lighthouses I've climbed up in and climbed down, because lighthouses are fascinating.
Mhm.
And the mansion itself in real life was not as elaborate as we might think. You know, when we hear the word mansion, we're thinking a big, elaborate, like what I've described. So
Right.
in real life, it was a smaller dwelling, but it had this. It really did have this casino carved out of the limestone, you know, to make a
Mm-hmm.
basement for the casino, and they had dinners and they had parties. So it was very lavish for the era in which it was built. I made it a little bigger and a little bit more elaborate, partly because as a nod to Christy or to Rebecca, and also because I think, you know, the interesting thing about writing historical fiction is you want to be true to the time period you're writing about, but your readers have modern sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a modern sensibility would expand the reality of that mansion or resort that was on Middle Island to be something a bit more elaborate. So I looked up um, like blueprints of old houses, blueprints of modern day mansions, just to try to get a sense of how did I want that house to be laid out, so that it made sense for, you know, the people in it and the plot twists that I wanted to include.
Hey, yeah, I read a little bit about the original place that was there too, and that like a lot of regionally known gangsters like did visit there, um almost like a resort for gangsters, not necessarily even to have to engage in criminal activity with each other, but like it was a place they could go be. And
Right.
that like Al Capone is rumored to have been
Yeah.
one of the people who
He was
visited
there.
there,
Hmm.
right? And so yeah, it was really like a criminal resort, right?
It was a
Where people
criminal
could
resort.
stay. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. And the actual uh, criminal is Joey Roscoe, who was, you
mhm.
know, a gangster out of Toledo and big on gambling as well as rum running. And um, he'd invite not only gangsters he was at peace with, but he would invite politicians and journalists and law enforcement. And, you know, of course, the
Mhm.
island's just over the line in Canada. So you could go there, you know, after Prohibition ended in Canada, and which it ended in Canada before in the United States. And it's legal that you're drinking on the island. But of
Right.
course, you know, some of their other activities on the island definitely weren't legal. And running whiskey, they called it rum running, but it was mostly whiskey,
Mhm.
um, into the US definitely wasn't legal. So yeah, it's an interesting history to the island for sure.
Yeah, and it's kind of the thing that we see depicted in some of like the old Hollywood movies where they get
Right.
together and socialize in a way they couldn't now with modern surveillance, right?
No,
It just
right.
wouldn't work. But you also included like that bit of Hollywood and like you said with modern sensibilities, people knew there were people of all different stripes and inclinations and things back then, but the rest of us didn't know. I mean, like the whole world didn't get it in their papers and their internet, and things. But
Right.
you included that and also I think did it like a really good job stretching out like the hints for it and the realities for it in a way that probably would have been socially appropriate, happened at that time. Did you research the
Yes.
Hollywood stuff too? Or is that something you already like had a handle on just from
Um,
popular culture?
yeah, just from I kind of relied on popular culture for that. I admit. I mean, I did look up, you know, famous actors and actresses at the time just to get an idea of how they would have dressed and how they would have carried themselves.
Hmm.
But yeah, those characters aren't based on a particular actor from the time. So
Okay. And the like the body under the duck and the surprise twist to like who it is and what happened. Did
right.
you know you were getting there when you did you write toward that, or was that something that
I did
happened?
right. Yeah, I did write toward that.
Okay.
So, you know, sometimes images just split in my head, and the image of that dock and the body and the notion of the twist kind of downloaded itself into my head at the beginning of the whole drafting process. So I knew that that's what I wanted to write toward. And that did not change. Some of the characters and how they acted and behaved and interacted with one another definitely did evolve, but I knew from the beginning that that's the twist I wanted to go for, and the imagery that I wanted to go for.
Okay. Now um I do want to know a little bit about Aurelia's future when we leave off, but I don't want you to give away secrets. But like, are we going to meet Aurelia again? Are you allowed to tell us that?
Yeah, I'm allowed to tell you that. And the answer is no.
Okay.
This is sorry. I have had
No, that's
people
all right.
ask, can't we get a sequel? I'm like, well, you could make one up in your own imagination. Um, so this is a standalone novel, and
Okay.
I feel like it ends right where it needs to for Aurelia. Her future is open. She is finally free, and that's kind of the point of the of her character arc, is that she
Mm-hmm.
needs to learn to let go of this guilt and this past and set herself free. I mean, she's captured in a sense on the island through basically blackmail. You're either going to be here working for us,
Mm-hmm.
or you're going to be dead, or you're going to be in prison. So, outside forces have trapped her, but what's more important is she's sort of trapped herself, um, with guilt, which I think is appropriate, and shame. But she also needs to learn to forgive herself and give herself the grace of freedom. So I like leaving her there. Like, she's free to do what she wants.
Yeah. And even though I was interested in where she went and what she was going to do, it didn't occur to me that she wasn't going to be successful at whatever it was.
Right.
I like you
Yes.
think,
I
okay, it's
yes.
going to be okay.
It's going to be, yeah. I mean, she's smart. She reads all the time, and she creates this wetsuit, and she figures out, who done it, and she figures out how to survive by herself for a while and how to get off the island as soon as possible. So she's smart. So yes, I envision her as having a good future. And Great Aunt Ruth did too. She,
Oh, good.
she and Betty moved back to Great Aunt Ruth's hometown, which is Ada, Ohio, um, and lived out the rest of their natural days, and totally peaceful lives, from all reporting, and as happy as she was going to be. Um, and so that's kind of what I want for Aurelia as well.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Do we have any questions, Chris? Has anybody else submitted questions?
Did you? There aren't any questions in the chat at this moment. I have a few questions, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But selfishly, I have a few questions instead. So, one of the phrases I've heard countless times is write what you know, and sometimes it's write who you know, and sometimes the person you know most is yourself. Is there a character in this
Mhm.
that you particularly find yourself identifying with?
I really like that. Right? What you know, right? Who you know, and the person you know best is yourself. I like that. I like that because, yeah, I try to think of each character as, they're fully, hopefully fully developed. So they're a separate person from me, but they each are an expansion of a little nugget of me, whether that's conscious or not. So, we all have past haunts that we need to free ourselves from. So, in that, hopefully not as traumatic as murdering your husband, but we all have something that, haunts us from our past. You can't be a human without that being the case, and so that's true of me as well. And so I put that aspect of myself in Aurelia. And we've all lost loved ones, or experienced tragedy. How do we respond to that? Well, it can help us eventually grow, or we can, become bitter. And so that aspect of myself, like, well, what if you didn't reframe this loss and you became bitter instead? That's Rosita, and so forth and so on. And so with Liam, we have him labeling all of his collected items. I can be obsessive too. So so I put that in an aspect of myself in him and just kind of expanded that. Um, so a little bit of me in everybody in the book, even the people I don't like in my book.
Well, that was my next question. Are there characters you find yourself just not enjoying? Like not as a writer, but more just them as a character?
Yeah. I tried to make everyone have, because we're all, complex, right? Well, all of us have aspects of ourselves that are lovable and likable, and all of us have aspects that aren't so much. So I tried to make everybody have something sympathetic about them. The only person I ended up not being able to come, I was Marco. He's just a terrible human being. I mean, I guess we needed one just totally terrible human being in this
Mhm.
novel. And that's him. I don't like him at all. Everybody else I have some sympathy for.
So at the top, I mentioned, oh, there's a great question in the chat. Let me finish my question and I'll get to Paulette's. I mentioned that this is your 16th published book. That's quite an extensive catalog. And in the chat, there is a link to Sharon's website. So please feel free to look through. I believe you have links to all of your publications on your
Oh
website.
my, yes, yes, I
Just a
do.
little plug, just a little plug for you. But I had a question. 16 books in, how do you find yourself having grown as an author?
Mm. A lot. I like to think a whole lot. My first published books are fine, but they were really me trying to write something that was good enough to be publishable. So I wasn't thinking as deep. Like my first books were PI mysteries. So I was trying to like, can I pull off writing a mystery that makes sense? Can I, play fair with the reader, plant red herrings, plant clues, have it make sense at the end? That was my total focus when I was first writing. And over the years, I've become much more interested in doing that, but very character driven. My books have become very much driven by the protagonists and all the other characters in the book. And I spend a ton of time turning these into real people. I know I made them up, but turning them into real people in my heads that in some of my characters' cases, I understand them better than people I know in real life. Probably not surprising since I did make them up, but that character driven aspect is what I really try to go for. And I've also become very well aware of readers, I think, want more than dialogue and stage directions on the page. We all have so many elements of entertainment that we can draw from. And frankly, television has become a lot of shows, not all of them, obviously, but a lot of shows have become just very sophisticated in terms of the depth of theme that's being explored, the acting, and of course, film and TV have music and they have stage direction and whatnot. And I don't have that as a writer. I just have words and my imagination. That's what I have. So I've become aware of wanting to make the language accessible, of course. I don't want to be precious and write prose that, and have people go, oh, look, that's really pretty prose. That's not the point. People want to read a book because they want a story. But I think the language being a bit more evolved and atmospheric is something I really tried to develop as well.
Just a few questions about your process, if you could speak more on it. Paulette, I had a question about your research into prohibition and rum running. And I kind of wanted to, I hope this is okay, Paulette, ask, is there anything in particular that surprised you in your research, like most surprisingly about rum running and prohibition on the Great Lakes?
Um, so I'm trying to think on the Great Lakes in particular. I think I was very surprised to learn how much criminal activity took place on the lakes. And yeah, I found that really interesting because I tend to think of the Great Lakes as they're massive, they're impressive, they can be dangerous, but I also think of them as sort of, you know, and there's not a storm, at least, quiet, it's nature. I don't think of it as a place of illegal activity. Maybe I should have. So I was, but I didn't. So I was surprised at how much illegal activity took place on the lakes during Prohibition.
Cynthia wanted to know, Cynthia writes, I'm glad to hear that you traveled to some islands, especially in cold weather, to nose around and get a feel for Lake Erie island life. They say, I know you can't visit Middle Island, but did you boat near it to take a closer look? Loved the book. Thank you, Cynthia.
Oh, thank you. I did not boat near it. I would have had to have somehow gotten a privately owned boat. So there are no ferries or like public transportation. There's public transportation that goes by that island if you're heading, for example, to Pele. Um, but I did joke, my editor and I did joke about, we know Middle Island is now owned by the Canadian government and it's a bird sanctuary. But could we get a paddle boat and make it out there? Would anybody notice? Well, so we were really truly joking. I don't know. I think it could have been fun. It could have been dangerous. But being on the island so close to Middle Island, I feel like I got a lot of the sense of, the wind, the waves, the kinds of birds, the kinds of trees. Because I also like to put that in my books, as much about nature as makes sense for the story. So, but hey, if anybody knows somebody who can get me to Middle Island legally, so I don't want to make the Canadian government mad at me, then let me know because I think it'd be cool. I would enjoy that.
Sally has a question sort of about how the sausage is made, if you will, about the publishing industry. Sally asks, how do you feel the publishing industry has changed over the course of your career? And then additionally, have you had to take on more responsibility for marketing than you used to, as an example? How have your publishers changed their priorities, given the rise of self-publishing?
Right. Yeah. So my first book came out in 92. So that's a long time ago. And publishing has changed a great deal. In 92, there weren't ebooks. There were LPs, maybe in CDs if you wanted an audio book, but there wasn't Audible. You could self-publish back then, but it was super expensive. It wasn't, it's so accessible now with Amazon, and other platforms to, write your book and self-publish it. Um, and then, of course, back in 92, we didn't have Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, X, all these platforms. So the way writers reach readers has changed a bit through things like social media, being able to meet with all of you lovely people on Zoom. That certainly was not a thing back 30 plus years ago. In terms of how publishers look at things, writers are responsible for uh, some of their marketing. So, I'm responsible for my website, my email newsletter, my social media, choosing whether I will or will not go to mystery fan conferences. That's all on me in terms of my time and money, to decide. But I think publishers are pretty sophisticated about getting into, say, independent bookstores, libraries, places like the museum that would be, kind of hard for a self-published writer to be able to do. So that's a difference. I don't sense a lot of concern about, oh, self-publishing will take away readers from traditionally published people. Um, it's hard to find, every book hopefully finds its audience. Not every book is for every reader. I certainly would love it if everybody in the entire world read my work, but I know that's not going to happen. So I just, try to reach the audience that I think makes sense for my books, and whether it's on my own or through my publisher. But really, readers will find the books and the authors that they like. I don't have to really go out and, hey, do you like historical fiction set on Lake Erie? Uh, Come buy my book. People will, find based on their own tastes and methods. So.
I'm going to pass it over to Faith, who has a few more questions, and then we'll get a few closing thoughts, I think. It's almost that time, unfortunately.
Went fast.
Okay, first I wanted to say to Paulette that yes, there was rum running on the other Great Lakes. There was bootlegging on the other lakes, but there was Toronto was kind of a hotbed for it that I've learned. But Lake Erie had the western end of Lake Erie had the longest season that made it possible. So, the alcohol is coming from Canada to the States, and the western end of Lake Erie, the ice, happened later. Even there was more ice then, but it still was later then. And so that was where they could extend the season a little bit. And I had a couple questions for Sharon before we go. Is there anything about Trouble Island that you wish people would ask so that you could say it that we didn't hit?
Wow. That's a tough question.
Do you ever think, boy, I wish somebody would ask this, or I would like to talk about this?
Maybe, well, a little, yeah, the mechanics of the house. That is not a question I get, but that is an area that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out because I thought, okay, they're living year round on this island in a nice house. That's great, but it is also the 1930s. How are we heating it? How are we plumbing it? So I did a lot of research to try to make that realistic. So the whole deal with the furnace that's like a giant spaghetti monster with arms going everywhere. So I did a lot of research about that. I was fascinated to learn that actually the Delco generator that I have them use it's Delco, so it was created here in Dayton where I live.
Oh.
So I thought that was kind of fun that Delco made these generators that farms would often have. um, if you were pretty well off, it was like your own permanent. It's just like a generator you'd have now for your house if in case there's a storm. But back then it was pretty, fancy to if you had your own, basically your own utility company in your backyard because you have a generator.
Okay.
So it was interesting to learn about all that. And also, I mentioned all these nods to other people's work. I give a little nod to my own work because Aurelia is from southeastern Ohio, and the Jess Montgomery books, that's my pen name, are set in southeastern Ohio. So
Okay, I enjoyed the mechanics of it. I think that they helped lend to the sense of foreboding of what's going to happen when they all break down if you're stuck there for the winter,
yeah,
right? Because then you're thinking, okay,
right.
it's working now, but so it did lend to that. And the other thing I wanted to know is who are you reading? Like, who would you recommend right now?
Let's see. I love books. Well, right now I'm reading A Certain Kind of Starlight by Heather Weber, another Ohio author. It's magical realism, contemporary, just very heartfelt, quite lovely. So, A Certain Kind of Starlight is what I'm
Okay.
currently reading. Mystery wise, I love anything by Laura Lippman. She is a master of immersive storytelling. I don't know how she quite does it, but I read her opening sentence and I'm in this world already. That's all it
Oh,
took. So I love her books. Let's see. Um, for for shorter fiction, a book I love to recommend is called The Department of Historical Corrections, and I'm spacing on the author's name, but it's such a unique title. If you look it up, you'll find it right away. The Department of Historical Corrections, and the premise of the titular story in this collection is that there's a government department of historical corrections, and you
okay.
go and say, oh, well, no, George Smith, the founder of this town, was actually born in 1892, not 1891. We're going to fix it. But it gets way deeper than that. It starts to get into the question of, well, what is historical truth? You can see where I'd find that a fascinating theme.
Mm-hmm.
And what is myth, and how do we differentiate the two, and when does it matter, and when does it not matter? So really good collection of stories. Highly recommend that.
That sounds really interesting. Um, Paula did add that this is interesting, that she felt like she needed a prequel for what made Susan who she was.
Well, you get that at the end.
Yeah.
And that was by design as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I wanted, it was that, is she a reliable narrator? Is she, why did she make all the choices that she made to end up that eventually led her to be with Pony and then end up on this island?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's in the moment. The story, she's looking back, but there's so much that's happening that she has to deal with in the moment, even though she's looking back at these moments. And I thought, I don't want to stop the narrative for her to then like tell the reader about her childhood. So the scene near the end, she's finally alone, so she can finally let her mind kind of go back to that and then share it with the narrator or share it with us.
Right. And I mean, I know I said it before, but I did really like that. Okay, I'm super interested in what's going to happen next, but I don't have any doubt that it's going to be okay. Right.
It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Do you
Really
want to?
okay.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us what you have planned, or
Sure.
what you have coming up next, or
Yeah,
coming out next?
Well, I don't have a contract yet, but I have submitted pages and a synopsis for a standalone historical suspense.
Oh.
I won't say more than that. It's standalone, just like this one was. And if it comes out, it would probably be in 2026 would be my guess. But you can always go to my website and sign up for my email newsletter, or just visit my website, and I keep all the news up to date there about what's coming out.
Okay. Great. We'll watch in 2026. Put that on the calendar. And just want to remind people that if you haven't read the book yet, you can get it through the museum store, online or in person. It has been so great to meet you. I enjoyed this talk. That was good. I hope you enjoyed visiting with us virtually too. Okay.
I did very much.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Where did my Zoom go?
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for a great discussion. And thank you for carrying my book.
Oh, you're welcome. We're happy to. It's so many local ties, and just even like the descriptions were so great. When I read about the Fresnel lens, I'm like, she was here. She looked at our Fresnel lenses, right?
I did. It really was. I really did.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. Chris, do you want to say goodbye to everyone?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you, Sharon, for being here. I can second everything both of you said. Please follow Sharon everywhere. The books we have are very generously autographed. So if you want a nice autographed, nice new crisp edition, please feel free to get it. But they could also support you directly, I think. Is that true, Sharon? Yep.
Yeah. Well, yes, by following me on social media or signing up for my newsletter.
There you go. That way, that'd be the best way to learn about your new standalone. Right.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Well, I hope to see everyone here next month for our second installment. This was a great way to kick off our Great Lakes Book Club. Next month, just a brief, if you haven't started reading the book, The Raging Erie, Life and Labor Along the Erie Canal by Mark Ferrara. But that is a nonfiction novel. That's correct, Kate. I haven't got a chance to read it yet. I can't look at you. Sorry, she's right behind me. Did I just spoil the illusion to everyone? I haven't. Unmute me real quick? Yeah, I'm gonna unmute her right
now. Okay, The Raging Erie is about the building of the Erie Canal. It is by Mark Ferrara. What's different about it, and part of why I chose it, is that it focuses on the communities who were disrupted and who participated during the building. We always get like the big companies story, the land movers, the steel baron, like all of that perspective. Mark went into the stories of the people who did the labor, who drove the horses, who lived there. The same way that like when a lot of highways were built in America in the 50s and 60s and whole communities were displaced, that did happen with the Erie Canal as well. And he covers all of that, all of the people who you're not used to reading about or learning about when such a monumental project takes place.
That sounds really good.
Okay. All right.
We'll have to see you there next month. That's the only,
There
we'll
you
have
go.
to talk about it next month.
Mhm.
Just as a last word, I'd like to thank everyone for being here. It is 1 p.m., so we will be signing off, but follow along, look for Sharon's new book in 2026, potentially. Very exciting. For Faith and Sharon, I've been Chris. Thank you all for being here.